Intersectional Solidarity. Property Rights over Female Slaves' Bodies. Excerpts from Angela Davis, The Legacy of Slavery, Standards for a New Womanhood. Chapter 1, Women, Race, and Class. Throughout the South, state legislatures adopted the principle of partus sequitur ventrum, the child follows the condition of the mother. 1 year after importation of Africans was halted, a South Carolina court ruled that slaves had no legal claims whatever on their children. Consequently, according to this ruling, children could be sold away from their mothers at any age because the young of slaves stand on the same footing as animals. In the eyes of the slaveholders, slave women were not mothers at all. They were simply instruments guaranteeing the growth of the slave labor force. They were breeders, animals whose monetary value could be precisely calculated in terms of their ability to multiply their numbers. Slaveholders naturally sought to ensure that their breeders would bear children as often as biologically possible, but they never went so far as to exempt pregnant women and mothers with infant children from the fields. Expediency governed the slaveholders' postures toward female slaves. When it was profitable to exploit them as if they were men, they were regarded in effect as genderless. But when they can be exploited, punished, and repressed in ways suitable only for women, they were locked into their exclusively female roles. Like the majority of slave men, slave women, for the most part, were field workers. I've included some pictures of Aunt Jemima pancake syrup over the years. Notice the idealization of Black women's situation in the Old South. Nowadays, the company is too embarrassed to even use the name Aunt Jemima. Women were not too feminine to work in coal mines, in iron foundries, or to be lumberjacks and ditch diggers. When the Santee Canal was constructed, slave women were a full 50% of the workforce. This is reminiscent of the horrendous utilization of white female labor in England as described in Marx's Capital. In England, women are still occasionally used instead of horses for hauling canal boats because the labor to produce horses and machines is an accurately known quantity, while that required to maintain the women of the surplus population is below all calculation. Proportionally, more Black women have always worked outside their homes than have their white sisters. The pandemic reminded us of this fact. Removal of white women from the productive sphere, the effect of the factory system on the economic role of women. During the pre-industrial era, women had been hand manufacturers, producing fabric, clothing, candles, soap, and practically all the other family necessities. They had been productive workers within the home economy, and their labor had been no less respected than men's. Compare with Angela Davis's description of housework as invisible, repetitive, exhausting, unproductive, and uncreative. The Industrial Revolution resulted in white women's lives being radically changed. By the 1830s, many of women's traditional economic tasks were being taken over by the factory system. The industrialization of the economy eroded women's prestige in the home, a prestige based on their previously productive and absolutely essential labor. Their social status began to deteriorate accordingly. As workers, women had at least enjoyed economic equality, but as wives, they were destined to become servants to their husbands. The situation of the white housewife was full of contradictions. The more women's domestic duties shrank under the impact of industrialization, the more rigid became the assertion that women's place is in the home. Early intersectional solidarity. White abolitionists Sarah and Angelina Grimke-Weld. More than any other women in the campaign against slavery, the Grimkes urged the constant inclusion of the issue of women's rights. At the same time, they argued that women could never achieve their freedom independently of Black people. The Grimke sisters had such a profound consciousness of the inseparability of the fight for Black liberation and the fight for women's liberation, they were never ensnared in the ideological snare of insisting that one struggle was absolutely more important than the other. They realized the dialectical character of the relationship between the two causes. Angela Grimke-Weld said, "I want to be identified with the Negro. Until he gets his rights, we shall never have ours." Social Reproduction Feminisms, 1969 to present. Social reproduction feminism is a fusion of Marxism and feminism. Its origins can be traced back to the utopian socialists of the 1800s. Marx and Engels formalized the theory and applied it to offer economic, sociological, and anthropological analyses of the institution of male domination. But although they viewed the abolition of patriarchy as central to the socialist project, the early Marxist, quote-unquote, scientific socialists tended to focus on what they called productive labor, by which they meant labor that produces an exchangeable physical item, a commodity. So-called service workers, including healthcare, education, the performance arts, and food service, are hardly even mentioned in Marx's Capital. The historically varied blend of productive and service-oriented labor, characteristic of domestic work, would have to wait until the late 1960s to be rigorously analyzed by thinkers in the Marxist tradition. Margaret Benston's 1969 article, The Political Economy of Women's Lives, advanced the thesis that, quote, household labor, including childcare, constitutes a huge amount of socially necessary production, but is not usually considered real work, since it is outside of trade and the marketplace, end quote. Social reproduction feminism, SRF, has continued to develop, incorporating and reflecting concerns from other feminist traditions. See Susan Ferguson's 2016 article on intersectionality and SRF. Let's see how three social reproduction feminists articulate the core principles of SRF. As Ferguson says, SRF is not simply concerned with a vague inequality between men and women, but instead focuses on the dynamics of a single logic in which patriarchy and capitalism are co-constituted and reproduced. Vogel distinguishes between the character of women's oppression in the propertied and in the working classes. She says, in propertied classes, women's oppression flows from their role in the maintenance and inheritance of property. In subordinate classes, female oppression derives from women's involvement in processes that renew direct producers, the workers, as well as their involvement in economic production. Bhattacharya lays out a general call to action as follows. Our solution as Marxist revolutionaries is not simply to talk about the importance of class struggle, but to link the struggles of the formal economy to those outside of it. The best way to fight for women's rights in the sphere of production is through our labor organizations, but the working class doesn't work only in its workplace. We provide the analytical linkage between the two spheres of the single system through Marxist theory, and act as a tribune of the oppressed, particularly when the fight is not generalized to the workplace. How do trans people fit into all this social reproduction stuff? This is just my take, just one person. I'm not speaking for DSA or any other group. A key difference between male domination of women and the subjugation of transgender people is that, in the latter case, the extinction of the group is often sought by its oppressors. Trans people's bodies, when directly regulated by the state, are regulated not just in their aspect of being potential biological means of reproduction, but also in their very existence. That is, trans people face genocide, if not in their literal extinction as human beings, then at least culturally. The principle at work in state policies that deny transgender care or force detransition is akin to the principle, kill the Indian, spare the man. The correct strategy for the socialist left is not one of intersection, but of union. An injury to one, as they say, is an injury to all. Compare Ralph Miliband's dual power strategy of strong Marxist reformism. He says, what we need is a flexible, and complex network of organs of popular participation, working alongside but independently of the state.